Smoke fell like gray snow, and the mare did not run. She stood in the wind, head tilted, reading the fire's breath, as if the valley were whispering a map. He found her there, hands burned by other nights, eyes gone quiet, listening to a sound only hooves could answer. Behind them, sirens fading, doors closing, names not yet called. Ahead, a black river, a cliff that turned the world into sky, and one narrow trail the light had forgotten. If they step now, someone lives. If they wait, the wind decides. So he takes the rope, she takes the lead, and together they move where fear won't go. Tonight, one life must anchor many, and dawn will tell what the valley chose to keep. Ash fell like slow snow over the valley, each flake a gray prayer drifting through air that tasted of copper and burned pine. The Mustang stood at the fence line, motionless as carved stone, her scarred shoulder catching the strange amber light that comes when the sky forgets how to be blue. She did not flinch as embers settled on her dark coat like dying stars, did not turn her head when the distant rumble of engines carried promises no one could keep. Her nostrils flared once, twice, reading the wind's bitter message with an instinct older than human fear. The truck wheezed to a stop beside the feed store, dust plumes settling like surrender around its dented flanks. Jake Brennan sat for a heartbeat longer than necessary, callous hands gripping the steering wheel as if it were an anchor in rough seas. Through the windshield, the world looked wrong, too orange, too quiet, except for the radio's frantic static painting disasters in clipped, urgent syllables. Evacuation zones, road closures, a propane depot that had 90 minutes before it became a crater. He stepped into the thick air, rope burns pale as old chalk across his knuckles, and felt the valley hold its breath around him. Main Street wore evacuation like a fever, windows crosshatched with tape, hastily scrawled names on cardboard signs, a child's bicycle abandoned on the sidewalk as if its owner had simply vanished mid-pedal. The feed store's bell hung silent, and somewhere in the smoky distance a dog barked once and then gave up. The mare lifted her head, ears swiveling toward him with precision of radar. No halter marked her as owned, no fence claimed her as captive. She simply stood, where the earth felt truest beneath her hooves, reading fire's approach in the language of shifting air and heated stone. A crescent scar curved pale against her shoulder, old grief made visible, and Jake recognized it the way one burn recognizes another. His radio crackled to life, a voice thin from distance and desperation. All personnel, Highway 9 is compromised. Repeat, the primary evacuation route is compromised. Depot T-minus 87 minutes. The transmission dissolved into white noise, leaving only the sound of his own breathing and the mare's patient exhale. Jake pulled a topo mat from his truck bed, its creases worn soft as fabric from a dozen seasons of searching for ways around impossible terrain. His finger traced the river's oxbow, the saddle between twin ridges, the deer trails that threaded through alder thickets where water still ran cool and clear. Roads were failing, but the land remembered older paths. The mare stepped closer to the fence, close enough that he could see the intelligence in her dark eyes. The way she tested each breath for information his instruments could never provide. She knew something he was still learning, that when human plans crumble, the earth offers its own map to those willing to read it. A gust of superheated wind swept down from the ridgeline, carrying the scent of resin and desperation. The mare's ears flicked forward, not toward the approaching flames, but toward something deeper, a pull that spoke of water and shadow and paths that existed in the spaces between panic and prayer. Jake folded the map and met her gaze, understanding passing between them like a shared secret. The valley's reckoning had begun.
Section 2. The World Before.
Seeds of connection. Before the fires painted the ridge red, the valley woke each morning to gentler rhythms. Irrigation water whispered through aluminum pipes, carrying the promise of green pastures through another summer's heat. Swallows traced lazy arcs above the rodeo grounds, where dust still held the memory of last weekend's competition, and the feed store bell counted out the day's arrivals with the patience of a grandfather clock. Jake had learned this country as a boy, mapping it not in miles, but in moments. The switchback where hawks caught thermals at noon, the creek bend where trout rose to evening hatches, the particular slant of light that meant his mother would be setting supper on the table. His father had taught him to read weather and the behavior of cattle, to gauge the coming season by how high the deer browsed, to respect the small signs that spoke louder than any forecast. But that was before helicopters in drop zones, before he learned a different language of wind speed and fuel moisture and the terrible mathematics of flame. The day Marcus died, Jake had trusted speed over sense, pushing their advance too fast through a draw that looked clear on the morning maps. The gust came cross-slope without warning, and Marcus's voice cut out mid-sentence on the radio, leaving only the roar of a world consuming itself. After that, stillness became suspect. Jake stayed in motion because motion could be measured, tallied, proven on reports that provided the illusion of control. Between seasons, he walked the valley's back roads with coffee growing cold in his hands, trying to remember how to listen before deciding, how to wait before moving. The mare had her own education in patience. Born wild on the high plats where alkali crusted the earth and sedge grass whispered secrets to the wind, she learned early that the ground could lie. Gopher holes masquerading as solid footing, shale that sang warnings before it shifted, clay that smiled until it tried to swallow your hoof whole. The winter she was 3, ice had made a betrayer of familiar stone, sending her sliding down a granite face that carved its signature into her shoulder. The crescent scar healed pale as old bone, but something deeper had changed. She moved afterward like a jeweler handling diamonds, testing each surface before committing, feeling for the truth that lived beneath appearance. Men had tried to claim her with ropes and corrals, but she spoke a different dialect of freedom. She learned fence lines not as barriers, but as suggestions, memorizing which posts gave way to pressure and which gates hung loose enough for a patient nose to work open. Under starlight, she moved like water finding its level. Under storm, she stood solid as bedrock, and under the scrutiny of would-be owners, she simply waited until their interest moved on to easier conquests. The valley bound them together through small, unwitnessed moments. Jake fixed a gate latch that had been sticking since spring, leaving it adjusted just loose enough to swing free at a touch. The mare watched from the far side of the pasture, close enough to bolt, still as a held breath. He started pausing at her fence post, not speaking. What was there to say to a creature that already knew everything about survival that mattered? The drought crept into their shared geography like an uninvited guest that refused to leave. Springs that had run clear for generations began whispering instead of singing. Grass cured early, turning the color of old rope, and the ridge pines began dropping needles in July. Red flag warnings shifted from occasional alerts to daily liturgy, and people started folding bandanas into their glove compartments the way previous generations had carried spare change. On the last good morning before the world caught fire, Jake had watched the mare test the wind at dawn, her head lifted toward pressures he couldn't feel, ears mapping currents invisible to human senses. He'd thought then about the physics of patience, about how stillness could be its own kind of motion, when it meant the difference between reading the land and merely walking across it. Neither of them knew they were rehearsing for a night when stillness would become the only speed that could save lives, when a mare's instinct for solid ground would matter more than any map ever drawn, and when the space between heartbeats would hold all the room left in the world for hope. The first lightning strike came without thunder, a dry fork of heat that kissed the ridge and left twin columns of smoke rising like incense from an angry altar. Jake felt it in his chest before he saw it, the valley drawing breath and holding it too long, the way air thickens before a storm that will bring everything but rain. By the time he reached the Grange, the parking lot had transformed into a scene from the end of the world. Pickup trucks backed against the loading dock while families loaded whatever they couldn't bear to lose. Photo albums wrapped in garbage bags, bird cages covered with dish towels, a child's stuffed elephant clutched against the grandmother's chest like a talisman. The smell of coffee fought with creosote and fear, losing ground with each passing minute. Inside, volunteer Fire Chief Martinez spread maps across a folding table that had hosted 100 bake sales and blood drives, his hands shaking just enough to make the papers tremble. "We've got maybe an hour before the depot goes," he said, not quite meeting anyone's eyes. "Highway 9 is already compromised. The bridge at Miller's Crossing took a tree across both lanes 20 minutes ago." Jake pushed through the crowd to the table, his mind already translating the crisis into the cold mathematics of terrain and time. The propane depot sat like a loaded gun at the valley's only paved exit, 20,000 gallons of liquid fire waiting for the wrong spark. When it went, not if, when it went, it would take the bridge, the road, and any hope of conventional evacuation with it. He pulled his own topple from his jacket, creased soft as silk from years of consultation, and spread it beside Martinez's newer maps. His finger found the river's oxbow, traced the alder gulch that fed it, followed the deer trail that threaded between two low ridges most people never noticed. "There," he said, tapping a spot where elevation lines crowded together like worried friends. "Game trail through the saddle, drops into Willow Creek and follows it to the river bend." "That's not a road," Martinez said, stating the obvious like it might change the facts. "Roads are burning," Jake replied. "This won't." The mare had followed him to the Grange, standing just outside the circle of light cast by the loading dock's floods, close enough to hear the human panic, far enough to bolt if instinct demanded it. Her ears swiveled constantly, reading wind currents and pressure drops with an accuracy no weather service could match. When Jake glanced her way, she was facing not toward the approaching flames, but toward the gap between ridges where ancient waters had carved the path through stone. The doubts came fast and frantic. Sarah Chan clutched her twin boys close, their superhero backpack stuffed with treasures that would mean nothing to anyone else. "I can't take them up there," she said, voice tight with the particular terror of a mother whose children might die because of her choices. "Tommy's asthmatic. The smoke." "Smoke will be thicker on the highway," Jake said gently. "This way keeps us below it most of the way." Old Pete Kowalski shook his head, age spots dark against skin gone pale with fear. "My Emma can't make that kind of hike. Hell, I'm not sure I can," his wife said in their truck cab, oxygen tank hissing softly, looking fragile as spun glass. "We carry what we need to carry," Jake said. "We leave what we need to leave." But it was young Danny Morrison who asked the question that stopped conversation cold. "What if you're wrong?" The words hung in the smoky air like an accusation. Jake had been wrong before, catastrophically wrong, and Marcus Rivera was dead because of it. The memory lived in his chest like a splinter that never worked its way out. The radio silence, the search, the moment they found what was left after the fire had finished its work. He looked at the faces around him and saw his own doubt reflected in their eyes. These weren't trained firefighters who'd signed up for risk. They were teachers and mechanics and retirees, people whose biggest adventure was usually deciding between regular and premium at the gas station. If he led them into the wilderness and the fire cut them off. The mare moved then, just a single step closer to the light, but it was enough.
She wasn't looking at the humans with their maps and radios and desperate calculations. She was looking at the ridge where the game trail began, head tilted as if listening to a conversation only she could hear. Her nostrils flared once, testing air currents for information that instruments couldn't measure. "She knows," Jake said, more to himself than the others, but Danny heard him. "Know what?" "Where the water is." Jake folded his map, deciding crystallizing like frost on winter windows. Animals don't lie about safe ground. They can't afford to. Martinez keyed his radio one more time, got nothing but static seasoned with fragments of distant panic. Emergency frequencies were overloaded, dispatch scattered to the winds, and official evacuation routes collapsing faster than anyone could update the maps. "How many can you take?" he asked finally. Jake counted faces, measured them against the narrow trail and the time they had left. "Everyone who wants to go." He caught Martinez's eye. "You coming?" The chief looked at his radio, his maps, and the responsibility that sat on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Someone needs to coordinate with the county and try to get buses through before the depot blows. They both knew buses weren't coming. The county had bigger fires and more populated areas to worry about. The valley was on its own, same as it had always been when the chips were down. People made their choices in the next 10 minutes. Some staying with the official plan that was no plan, others gathering what they could carry and following Jake toward the loading dock where the mare was waiting like a patient guide at the entrance to an underworld that might, if they were lucky and brave and good, lead back to light. The depot's alarm began wailing in the distance, a mechanical scream that meant time had just gotten shorter. Jake shouldered his pack, checked the coil of climbing rope clipped to his belt, and looked one last time at the map that might lead them to safety or deliver them to something worse than the fire they were fleeing. The mare turned toward the ridge and took her first step into darkness. Jake followed, and behind them came the sound of people choosing hope over certainty, faith over fear, and the unknown over the unsurvivable. The game trail narrowed to a whisper between stone walls, wide enough for hope, but narrow enough for doubt to crowd in from both sides. Above them, the fire had found its voice, a low roar that built in the throat of the canyon like a beast learning to speak. Below, nothing but air, and the dark geometry of the valley floor, invisible beneath layers of smoke that moved like slow water through the draws. Jake counted steps because counting was control, or at least the memory of it. Behind them, the column stretched single file along the ledge. Sarah Chan with her twins tethered to her belt by knotted clothesline, old Pete half carrying Emma between breasts I came too hard, Danny Morrison clutching a backpack that probably held more video games than water. 23 souls trusting their lives to a mare's instinct and a man who'd already proven he could get people killed. The emberfall began as a whisper, soft impacts against stone and fabric that mimicked rain until you realized rain didn't burn. A spark landed on Tommy Chen's shoulder and he yelped, slapping it away with the reflexive horror of a child learning that the world contains malice. His cry rippled back through the line like electricity through copper wire, panic seeking purchase wherever fear had left the ground soft. "Eyes forward," Jake called back, keeping his voice level, unremarkable, the tone a man might use to comment on weather. "Watch your feet, follow the mare." The mare moved with the deliberate precision of a jeweler handling diamonds, each hoof placement a question asked and answered before weight committed. She paused at a section where the trail kinked around an outcrop, head lowered to study something in the stone that only she could see. For a heartbeat, the entire column held its breath, waiting while she decided whether the ground was honest or a liar wearing the mask of safety. She chose the outer edge, hose finding purchase where human eyes saw only shadow and suggestion. Jake followed her line exactly, memorizing the angle of her weight distribution, the way she shifted before stepping rather than after. Behind them, the column learned through mimicry what he couldn't have explained in a textbook: how to become smaller, quieter, more willing to trust the testimony of stone over the demands of fear. The radio on his belt crackled once, a ghost of a voice dissolving into static. He turned the volume down an hour ago when it became clear that dispatch had nothing to offer but increasingly desperate iterations of the same prayer: evacuate, evacuate, evacuate. He already was, just not on roads that were busy becoming memories. Emma Kowalski stumbled, her oxygen tank clanging against rock with a sound that made everyone's heart skip. Pete caught her with the practice ease of 50 years together, his arm becoming the support beam that kept their small world from collapsing. "I got you," he murmured, words meant for her but loud enough that others could borrow the promise. "I got you."
The trail descended into a pocket where alder grew thick enough to filter smoke, and for 20 blessed steps, the air tasted almost clean. Water whispered somewhere close, a sound that worked on the nervous system like a sedative, promising that the world still held gentleness if you knew where to look. The mare lowered her head to drink from a seep that Jake would have walked past, teaching the lesson that salvation often hides in places too humble for human attention. They stopped there for 5 minutes that felt like hours, passing water bottles that emptied too fast and refilled too slowly from the tiny spring. Jake walked the column, checking faces for the 1,000 warnings of imminent collapse, the glassy stare that preceded heat stroke, the too rapid breathing that signaled panic's final stages, or the quiet resignation that sometimes came before a person simply sat down and refused to rise. "How much further?" Sarah Chan asked, not demanding, just needing to parcel out hope in measured doses her boys could manage. "Half hour to the river bend," Jake said, shaving 10 minutes off his estimate because lies could be merciful if told for the right reasons. Danny Morrison appeared at his elbow, face streaked with ash that made him look decades older than his 16 years old. "My dad was on the highway," he said quietly, heading back from Spokane. "You think he made it through before the bridges went?" Jake had learned in his years fighting fire that hope was a currency you spent carefully, but also that people needed something to burn that wasn't themselves. "If anyone could talk their way through a roadblock, it's your old man," he said, which was both truth and evasion, and exactly what the boy needed to hear. The mare lifted her head, ears swiveling towards something the humans couldn't yet perceive. Jake felt his pulse quicken, adrenaline preparing his body for threats his conscious mind hadn't identified. The wind had shifted, bringing heat from a new quarter, and with it the particular smell of propane finding oxygen. The depot was going. The explosion when it came was less sound than pressure, a change in the air that registered in the bones before the ears made sense of it. A fireball rose beyond the ridge like a second sun being born in the wrong part of the sky, casting shadows that ran in impossible directions. The column froze, watching their last guaranteed route home transform into a funeral pyre visible from 3 counties over. "Keep moving," Jake said, because stopping now would let the horror root them to stone. But the doubt came anyway, riding the shockwave of that explosion, whispering in the spaces between heartbeats. He'd made the call. He'd brought them into the wilderness on the word of a scarred Mustang and his own broken compass of judgment. If the fire jumped the ridgeline, if the wind turned wrong, if the river proved too high to cross, these people would die because he'd told them to trust him, and trust was a currency he'd bankrupted once before. Marcus's face flickered in his mind, younger than memory should allow, grinning from beneath a helmet that would, 20 minutes later, melt in heat intense enough to turn stone to glass. "Rapid advance," Jake had ordered, believing that speed was the same as courage, that pushing hard was the same as pushing smart. He'd been wrong then. What if he was wrong now? The mare moved forward, sure-footed as prayer, and Jake followed because the only thing worse than possibly being wrong was definitely giving up. Behind him, the column matched this pace, 23 lives strung together on a thread of hope so thin you could barely see it in the smoke. But it held. For now. It held. And for now, all of them had left.
Section 5. The Mirror Moment. A Glimmer of Light. The ledge ended at a place where the earth had changed its mind about being solid. To the left, the valley dropped away into smoke and darkness, a void that whispered promises about what happened to bodies that forgot how to balance. To the right, heat pressed against exposed skin like a hand testing how much pressure flesh could take before it remembered it was flammable. Ahead, the trail pinched to a strip of limestone barely wider than a boot, crumbling at the edges where frost and time had been arguing with stone for centuries. The mare stopped so suddenly that Jake nearly collided with her hindquarters. She stood utterly still, head lowered, ears pricked forward towards something he couldn't see or hear through the chaos of wind and flame. Her nostrils flared, pulling in information from air currents that spoke a language older than words. And when she finally moved, it was a single step sideways, repositioning her weight with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. Behind them, the column compressed, like a spring being wound too tight. Jake felt the rope at his belt go taut as someone in the rear pressed forward, fear overriding sense, panic beginning its final metamorphosis into the kind of stampede that could send them all over the edge. Danny Morrison broke first. The boy lunged forward, trying to squeeze past Jake and the mare, teenage immortality colliding with very mortal terror. "We have to move," he shouted, grabbing Jake's jacket. "We can't just stand here." The rope yanked hard, physics translating panic into pounds of force that pulled Jake toward the void. He felt his boot heel slide, found himself looking down at darkness that went on forever, and in that crystalline instant saw the choice that mattered: chase the boy and probably take them both over the edge in a tangle of limbs and screaming, or become something heavier than fear. He wrapped the rope twice around a juniper trunk that had been growing from a crack in the stone since before Jake's grandfather learned to walk. The tree's roots held mysteries about how to grip stone that no engineer could replicate, and when Jake dropped his weight against it, the rope hummed with sudden tension, physics becoming prayer. "Stop," he said, not shouting, not pleading, just stating facts in the same tone you'd use to mention that water runs downhill. The rope carried his stillness backward through the column, 23 people feeling through their hands and hearts that someone had finally become immovable. Danny froze, caught between forward momentum and the line that had suddenly remembered how to be a spine. His eyes were wild, ringed with white, and Jake recognized that look, had worn it himself in the helicopter on the way to identify what remained of Marcus after the fire finished its work. "Look at me," Jake said quietly, "not the drop, not the fire, me." The boy's gaze found him, latched on like drowning man finding driftwood. "The mare hears something," Jake continued, "something we can't hear yet. You trust me?" Danny's breath came in ragged gasps, but he managed a nod. "Then trust her." Jake shifted his weight, testing the juniper's hold, finding it solid as a promise that had never been broken. She's not stopping because she's scared, she's stopping because she's listening. And in that moment, Jake understood what he'd been doing wrong for the 3 years since Marcus died. He'd been trying to outrun his guilt, believing that motion was the same as progress, that if he just moved fast enough and hard enough and far enough, eventually he'd leave the weight of his mistakes behind. But speed was what had killed Marcus. Speed had been the lie he'd told himself was courage. The mare's ears swiveled, locking onto a sound that finally reached Jake's duller human hearing, the hollow whisper of water moving beneath stone, a river running through caverns the surface world had forgotten. She took another step, this one angling upstream along the cliff face, following a path that existed only in the language of pressure and current that she spoke fluently, and Jake was only beginning to learn. "One at a time," he called back to the column, his voice carrying the weight of certainty he'd found wrapped in juniper roots. "Follow her line exactly, step where she steps, trust the ground she chooses." Sarah Chen came first, twins tethered to her like planets to a sun, and Jake watched her feet find the exact placement the mare had tested and approved. Pete and Emma followed, moving with the careful choreography of people who'd learned to dance together when one of them needed oxygen and the other needed to be needed. One by one, the column reformed around a new understanding that the fastest way forward was sometimes standing still enough to hear what the earth was trying to say. The mare found the river's hidden seam, a tongue of limestone extending into the current like a dock built by geology instead of carpenters. Water rushed past it, black as old blood in the smoke-filtered moonlight, cold enough that Jake could feel it from 10 feet away. The far bank held willow shadow and sand that would hold footprints, proof that solid ground still existed somewhere in a world that seemed determined to turn everything to ash. He looked at the juniper that had held them when panic tried to scatter them like leaves. His hands bore the spiral imprint of its bark, stigmata that would fade in a few hours but which had, for a few critical heartbeats, been the only truth that mattered. "Thank you," he whispered, to the true or the mare or the ghost of Marcus who maybe finally could stop haunting him if Jake could just learn to be the anchor instead of the arrow, the stillness instead of the speed, the roots instead of the reaching. The mare stepped into the river, and this time when Jake followed, it wasn't because he was leading, it was because he'd finally learned to trust something wiser than his own fear, older than his own guilt, and more honest than any plan he could draw on a map. The column followed their guide into water that promised, if they could just keep moving forward with the same patience the stone had shown in learning to hold, to carry them all the way home. Section 6. The Climb. The Path to Redemption. The river hit like a fist of ice wrapped in velvet, cold enough to stop breath and thoughts and everything except the immediate screaming truth of survival. The mare waded forward with the deliberate care of someone reading Braille, each hoof testing depth and current before committing weight.
Water climbed her legs in dark bands, turning her coat slick and seal-like, and she angled upstream into the push, cutting against the current's insistence with a geometry that looked wrong until Jake understood she was using the river's own force to stabilize her stance. He followed her line exactly, rope tied around his waist and the other end secured to the juniper on the far bank, creating a handrail made of braided nylon and faith. The cold climbed his shins like a living thing with teeth, found his knees and tried to convince them they were made of something less reliable than bone. His boots slipped on river stone, polished smooth by centuries of passing water, caught on gravel that shifted treacherously, and twice he felt himself begin to list toward the void before the rope caught him, and the mare's steady presence ahead gave him something to aim for besides panic. 2 steps to depth, he called back, voice carrying over the water's roar. 3 to midstream. Count them out, it helps. Sarah Chen came next, twins tied to her belt with the same clothesline that had held them together on the ledge. She moved with the fierce concentration of a mother who has calculated that death is preferable to losing her children, and therefore has decided that neither will happen on her watch. When the current grabbed at Tommy's small legs, threatening to sweep him downstream like driftwood, she planted her feet and became an island, immovable, and the river learned that some things it couldn't take no matter how insistently it asked. Behind them, the column entered the water in a sequence that looked choreographed, but was really just terror finding rhythm. Old Pete went in with Emma leaning heavily on his shoulder, her oxygen tank held high like a torch against the darkness. Danny Morrison followed, his earlier panic burned away by cold that made everything except forward motion seem theoretical and unimportant. The mechanic from the Grange clutched a plastic tub containing photographs that had already started to dissolve, but he held them above water anyway because some gestures mattered more than their outcomes. The mare reached midstream where the river ran deepest. Water climbed to her chest and paused. For a heartbeat, Jake's old fears rushed back. What if she'd led them into a trap? What if the current was too strong? What if he'd trusted the wrong guide and these people were about to pay for his judgment with their lives? But then she moved again, 3 deliberate steps upstream, and suddenly the roar diminished and the pull eased, and he understood she'd found a seam in the chaos, a path where limestone beneath created an eddy that turned enemy into ally. "Follow her angle," he shouted, "not straight across, angle upstream. Let the river help you." One by one they learned, bodies discovering what the mare already knew, that sometimes the way forward requires first moving sideways, that fighting force with force is how you lose, and that water will carry what trusts its intelligence instead of fearing its power. The twins stopped struggling against their mother's grip and started floating, becoming lighter, easier, children remembering they were meant to live in a world that could be both dangerous and beautiful. Pete found a rhythm with Emma, 3 steps and a breath, 3 steps and a breath, measuring progress and heartbeats instead of distance. The crossing became liturgy, a ceremony repeated 23 times with variations in size and strength, but sameness in what mattered. Trust, placed in rope and rock and a scarred mare who refused to hurry even though fire painted the sky behind them in shades of emergency. Jake felt his shoulders unlock, felt the terrible weight of leadership redistribute itself into something that included rope and water and the collective determination of people who'd decided to survive because the alternative was unthinkable. A widow named Claire reached midstream, clutching a shoebox that held her husband's letters from Vietnam, paper that would dissolve the instant water found it. And Jake watched her make the calculation, hold the box higher and risk losing balance, or accept that some things can't be carried across certain thresholds. She lowered the box slowly, let the river claim it, and used both hands to grip the rope, her face showing a grief that was also a strange kind of relief. Letting go, Jake realized, was sometimes the bravest choice. The mare climbed the far bank with water streaming from her coat in silver rivulets, found solid ground, and stood while the column assembled itself in the willow shade. The sand there was fine and pale, accepting footprints like a guest book in a house that had been waiting for visitors. Sarah collapsed with her twins in her arms, crying with the deep, wrenching sobs of someone whose body had been given permission to acknowledge what it just endured. Pete sat heavily beside Emma,
their hands finding each other the way roots find water, automatically, necessarily, gratefully. Jake hauled himself up the bank, muscles screaming protest, rope burns on his palms bleeding through his gloves, and felt something fundamental shift in his chest. He'd held them, not through speed or force or the kind of aggressive competence that had killed Marcus, but through patience, through becoming the anchor that let others move, through trusting a mare who knew more about survival than any manual he'd ever memorized. The fire crowned behind them, jumping from pine to pine in a display that would have been beautiful if it weren't trying to kill them. But they were across now, water between them and the flames, and the willows made a tunnel that led deeper into the valley where the old fairgrounds waited with generator lights and coffee, and the kind of ordinary miracles that become possible when people decide not to give up. Danny Morrison appeared beside Jake, face streaked with ash and tears he'd probably deny crying if asked. "We made it," he said, voice rough with wonder and disbelief in equal measure. "We did," Jake agreed, watching the mare shake herself, sending a constellation of droplets glittering through smoky air. "She made it. We just followed." "Same thing though, isn't it?" Danny looked at him with eyes that had aged years in the last hour. "Someone has to know who to follow. That's leading too." Jake let the words settle, testing their weight, finding them surprisingly light. Maybe the boy was right. Maybe leadership wasn't always being first through the door, fastest down the mountain, most willing to charge into the kind of danger that makes heroes out of corpses. Maybe sometimes it was knowing when to let something wiser show the way, when to become the rope instead of the climber, the root instead of the branch. The column reformed in the willow tunnel. Quieter now, moving with the shuffling determination of people who've discovered they're stronger than they thought and more fragile than they'd hoped. The twins walked on their own feet, holding their mother's hands but no longer needing to be carried. Pete and Emma moved as one creature with two hearts, synchronized by 50 years of practice. Claire the widow walked empty-handed but lighter somehow, having learned that you can lose everything and still find reasons to keep walking. The mare led them downstream through the green corridor, hooves making soft percussion on sand that would hold their trail until the next rain came to erase it. Above them, stars began to pierce through the smoke, tiny promises that the sky remembered how to be something besides ceiling for hell. Water whispered to their left, speaking the ancient language of things that endure, and ahead, impossibly distant, but no longer impossible. Generator lights marked the fairgrounds like a runway for people who'd forgotten how to fly, but remembered, just in time, how to walk. The mare led them through darkness that was no longer absolute, carrying rope that had held when holding mattered, bearing scars that hurt less than they had an hour ago because pain with purpose is just sensation, and sensation means you're still alive. The debt that he had been carrying since Marcus died hadn't disappeared. That's like that never do. Not completely. But it had changed shape, becoming something he could carry without it carrying him, a weight that could be borne if you remembered to share the load. Behind him came the sound of people putting one foot in front of the other, the chorus of survival, the music that plays when the world catches fire and some damn fool decides to walk into smoke with nothing but hope and a horse that knows the way home. They were going to make it, not because the path was easy or the night was kind, but because they'd learned the lesson the valley had been trying to teach all along, that the way through hell is together, one step at a time, following those who know the terrain by heart instead of by map. The mare's ears pricked forward, reading the distance, and Jake trusted her to know how many more steps remained before rest became possible. For now, this was enough. Cold sand beneath boots, water crossed, fire at their backs instead of in their faces, and the slowly growing certainty that dawn, when it came, would find them alive to see it.
Section 7. The Resolution. A Debt Repaid. Dawn broke reluctant and gray, light filtering through smoke like a memory trying to remember itself. The fairgrounds had transformed overnight into a temporary city of the displaced. Generator lights fighting exhaustion, folding tables bearing coffee in paper cups that burned fingers and tasted like mercy. Jake sat on the tailgate of someone's Ford, rope coiled beside him, still damp from the river, and watched the column he'd led through hell sort itself into the living, the missing, and the names people weren't ready to say aloud yet. 23 had followed him and the mare into darkness. 21 had emerged. The math landed like a stone in his chest. Better than it could have been, worse than it should have been if the world were just. Sarah Chen found him first, twins asleep in the back of a borrowed pickup, their superhero backpacks serving as pillows. She said, "They're saying the highway convoy got cut off. 40 cars were trapped when the depot went. They're still counting." She paused, searching for words that could carry gratitude without making it heavier than it needed to be. "You saved my boys." Jake said the mare found the path, which was truth but also deflection, and Sarah wasn't having none of it. "You chose to follow her. You chose to trust something besides fear." She touched his shoulder briefly, contact that said what words couldn't, then returned to her sleeping children, who would grow up telling a story about the night their mother walked them through fire and water to reach morning. Chief Martinez emerged from the command tent looking like he'd aged a decade in the hours since Jake had last seen him. "County finally got through," he reported, voice rough with smoke and exhaustion. "Highway convoy, they lost 18 people when the fire jumped the road. It happened fast." He met Jake's eyes. "Your trail saved lives. However many we lost, it would have been more." The numbers tried to make themselves consolation and failed. 2 people had fallen from the ledge in darkness, a stumble, a scream cut short, and the terrible mathematics of gravity. Their names were Patricia Oakes, 73, who taught half the valley how to read, and Thomas Yu, 46, father of 2 who stayed calm even when the trail narrowed to nothing. Jake would carry them the way he carried Marcus, not as redemption for past failures, but as the price of decisions made in smoke and darkness when all the options were bad and standing still wasn't one of them. The mare stood in a makeshift corral, hay at her feet she hadn't bothered to touch, drinking water from a rubber tub like it was the most important work in the world. Her crescent scar caught the weak sunlight, a pale reminder that survival leaves marks. Jake approached slowly, not because he feared she'd bolt, but because the moment felt like church, and you don't rush into sanctuaries. He rested his hand on her neck, felt the steady engine of her heartbeat, the heat of life that asks nothing but continuation. "You knew. When I couldn't see the path, when I wanted to rush, when every instinct I had was telling me to move faster, you knew slow was the only speed that could save us." The mare's ears swiveled toward his voice, acknowledging or ignoring him with the magnificent indifference of creatures that live in a present tense untainted by guilt or glory. She'd done what she was made to do: read the land, find the safe passage, trust her instincts over human panic. That she'd saved 21 lives in the process was significant to the humans, but probably unremarkable to her. Danny Morrison appeared with a halter no one had asked for, looking uncertain. Was thinking maybe she should stay with us, at the fairgrounds I mean, till things calm down. Jake looked at the open gate, at the ridge beyond where the mare had been born, knowing things about survival that humans spend lifetimes trying to learn. He said, "She's not ours to keep. Never was." He opened the corral panel, watched the mare lift her head, and tested the air for information about what came next. She walked through, without hesitation, paused once to look back at the humans who'd followed her through the worst night of their lives, then moved toward the ridge with the unhurried confidence of someone who's never forgotten the way home. Jake watched her go, rope burns on his palm singing a song about the weight of others and the strength required to hold them, and felt something in his chest that wasn't quite peace, but was maybe its precursor, the understanding that some debts can only be repaid by becoming someone worth trusting when the world catches fire and people need a hand to hold in the darkness. The sun climbed higher, burning through smoke to find the valley still breathing, still standing, still counting its losses and its miracles in the same exhausted breath. Marcus was still dead. Patricia and Thomas had joined him, but 21 others had lived, and that would have to be enough because it was all there was. The mixed mathematics of disaster, where the sum never comes out even, but somehow you find ways to call it addition anyway. Jake coiled the rope that had held them all together, felt its weight settle familiar in his hands, and turned toward the coffee that people kept pressing into his palms like communion. The valley would burn for 3 more days before rain finally came. But its people were already rebuilding, already making plans, already deciding that fire was a season, not an ending. And somewhere on the ridge, a scarred mare grazed in the clean air above the smoke, carrying no guilt, claiming no glory, just being the thing she'd always been, a survivor, a guide, a teacher of the lesson Jake had finally learned, that sometimes the bravest thing isn't moving fast, but knowing when to stand still and let wisdom older than fear show you the way forward.
Section 8. The Afterglow, A New Beginning. 3 weeks after the fire, Jake returned to the fence where he'd first seen the mare standing against smoke and ending sky. The valley wore its scars openly, blackened timber like charcoal sketches of what had been, ash redistributing itself in geometric patterns that mapped wind's passage, and everywhere the peculiar silence of a landscape learning to remember what sound was for. But green was returning. Fireweed pushed through carbon in defiant purple clusters. Willows along the creek had begun leafing out with the aggressive optimism of things that have survived worse. And somewhere in the distance, a varied thrush was testing out melodies, seeing if beauty still worked in a world that had recently tried to end. The mare stood at her customary post, exactly where instinct or habit or something deeper had always told her solid ground could be trusted. Her coat had lost the river's sleekness, returned to its normal rough texture, dust from 3 weeks of ordinary grazing replacing the ash that had painted her ghostly. The crescent scar on her shoulder caught afternoon light, pale testament to an old fall that had taught her how to read the earth's honesty. She didn't startle when Jake approached, didn't do him the disservice of pretending she didn't recognize the human who'd followed her through darkness. Her ear swiveled toward him with the mild interest of someone acknowledging a neighbor's wave without needing to stop and manufacture conversation about weather. He'd brought an apple and felt foolish about it the moment he pulled it from his pocket. What did you give something that had saved your life and the lives of 20 others? Fruit seemed inadequate, but horses weren't complicated about gestures. She took it with velvet lips, crunched it methodically, and returned to watching the ridge where new growth was already beginning to fuzz the burned slopes with a green so tender it looked like hope someone had planted by accident. Jake leaned against the fence post that had survived fire through some accident of wind and luck, letting silence do what talking couldn't. His hands had healed, rope burns fading to pink lines that would eventually white scar and join the collection of marks that mapped every time he'd held tight when letting go would have been easier. The nightmares had started 3 days after the fire, the way they always did, his mind needing time to process what his body had endured. But they were different now. Less accusation than inventory, dreams that asked, "What did you learn?" instead of, "Why did you fail?" The valley was rebuilding in the way valleys do, slowly, stubbornly, with more arguments than agreements, but forward momentum despite itself. Sarah Chen had started a fund for Patricia Oak's grandchildren.
Pete and Emma Kowalski were living with their daughter in Spokane while their house was rebuilt. Danny Morrison's father had made it through the roadblock 5 minutes before the depot exploded, and father and son were learning how to talk about the night that had aged them both in directions that would take years to understand. The mare shifted her weight, tail flicking at a fly that didn't exist, performing the small rituals of being alive that had nothing to do with heroism or trauma or any of the words humans needed to make sense of what had happened. She'd done what she'd done, and then returned to the business of eating and sleeping and standing in places where the ground told the truth. There was a lesson in that simplicity, if Jake could learn to hear it. That survival wasn't about carrying the weight forever, but about knowing when to set it down and trust that tomorrow would bring its own requirements that couldn't be met by someone still bent under yesterday's burdens. He stayed until the sun dropped behind the western ridge, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber that looked nothing like fire and everything like the light that comes after. The mare grazed in slow circuits, occasionally pausing to lift her head and test the wind for messages written in languages older than smoke. When Jake finally turned to leave, he didn't say goodbye. Goodbyes were for endings, and this wasn't one. The valley would burn again someday. Valleys in dry country always did. And when it happened, there would be choices to make about speed and stillness, about trusting instruments or instinct, about whether to lead from the front or create the space for something wiser to show the way. He'd learned which choice mattered. A scared mare standing patient in the wind had taught him that the bravest thing isn't always moving fast through danger, but sometimes standing still enough to hear what the earth is trying to say, then following its wisdom even when every human instinct screams to do something else. The mare watched him go with the same mild acknowledgement she'd offered his arrival, then returned to her grazing, to her ridge, to her life that had briefly intersected with human desperation, and just as briefly shown them all what survival looked like when you stripped away panic and pride and the terrible need to control what cannot be controlled. Above them both, the first stars were beginning to appear in a sky that had remembered how to be something besides smoke. The valley breathed in, breathed out, and continued the patient work of becoming itself again. Scarred, humbled, alive, and somehow, impossibly, still capable of teaching those willing to learn that the way forward always starts with knowing when to stop, when to listen, and when to trust that the path exists even when you can't see it yet. The mare would not run. She never had. And in her stillness lived all the courage the valley would ever need.